seems to be our soils. It's the thing that you hear most about. And our soils are the basis for gardening. If your soils aren't healthy, it's going to make it very much a challenge for your plants to be healthy and for you to be excited about gardening at all. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how you can take what you have and improve that and turn it into a resource that will actually just really help you have healthy, viable, vibrant plants in your garden. And please bear with me, for some reason I tapped the keyboard and it's taking a while. So we're going to be talking about just an overview of, this is the overview, talking about the mechanical aspects of the soil, then this concept about the soil food web and how to make it work for you, how to improve your soils. And then we'll take questions at the end and be able to answer those and do a wrap up. So as I mentioned, it all starts with the soil. The role of soil is actually to feed the plants, but in turn, the plants decay and feed the soil. So formation occurs as this cycle continues over and over again, from plants growing, turning into waste, that waste being incorporated into the soil that provides nutrients back to the plants. Our soil provides a number of ecosystem services for life as we know it. It sequesters carbon in the soil, and I'll talk more about that because it's a big topic these days in the whole conversation about climate change. It purifies the water. In terms of soil, organisms have the ability to take contaminants out and purify only to a certain extent. The nutrient cycling that in terms of breaking down organic matter and feeding it back to plants, which then feed all the terrestrial animals that we have. It's a habitat for organisms, whether it's very small organisms or critters like ground squirrels and all the things that burrow underground. It can influence flooding and many other aspects. So soil formation starts with the parent material of minerals, and climate, topography, other organisms, and time affect that process. And it usually is a very long process of how the soil that we see around us even got made and became soil from rock. And when you take a look at the actual soil profile out in your garden, if you dig down and just can see a side view of what that looks like, you'll see that the top that we're really concerned with is the organic matter and the topsoil. Everybody is always like, where can I get topsoil? Or my topsoil is so bad. That is a relatively thin layer on top of everything else we have. I know in my own yard, I live in Cool, we have excellent soils here, but as soon as I get 12 to 18 inches deep, I'm hitting that unweathered, layered rock that we have underneath soil. And water still goes through it, but it's not usable. And you don't want to dig so deep or whatever that you're starting to bring that rock up into your soils. So the top three layers that we're really concerned with are that organic layer, hopefully there is one, the topsoil itself, and then the subsoil underneath it. That's all very workable. So the average garden soil is composed of approximately 45% weathered rock, minerals, the finer stuff that you see in the soil that you can get your hands in and work. 50% should be air and water, which is approximately the other half, that in terms of, especially that's where your roots are growing. And in the best case, you have approximately 5% organic matter. Here in the foothills, we're lucky to have somewhere in the order of 1% organic matter in our soils. Part of that is due to how we live and how we manage our landscapes. Out in the undisturbed areas, the oak woodlands, the forests, you'll generally find a lot more, a thicker layer of organic matter there. But again, as we move in and our homes are built and we start landscaping, have animals grazing, etc., we're mowing, we're weed eating, that organic layer is not anywhere near that percentage. So the air and water fills those voids in between all the minerals, and it's how how big those spaces are really affects the ability for plants to get their roots out into it to absorb water and minerals. So water traditionally moves through the soil, in a gravitational manner. It's pulled by gravity down through the soil. And then you always have a certain percentage of that water that stays in the soil and moves by capillary action sideways, and it can move up as well, depending on what types of soils you have. And that movement of water actually helps push out stale air and pull in fresh oxygen and that, which is very important, because if you don't have that, you can get soil-borne diseases. So that water, as I mentioned, pushes the stale air out and brings in fresh air from the surface. So that's why soil compaction can be very damaging to your plants in particular. That's what you're really concerned about, because as those pores decrease, now the roots have a hard time moving through, and your soil, the water's not moving through as efficiently as it should, and it's not able to store as much water. So in the absence of air, what happens is you get organisms producing alcohols that kill the plant roots. And so it oftentimes is very smelly, the sulfur smells that can build up in anaerobic conditions. And then there's always this little bit of water called hygroscopic water that binds to the surfaces chemically with the ionic bonds, that's always there, but it's not available to plant roots at all. So here we get to the crux of the mechanical aspects of our soils. You can see that there's a wide range of particle sizes. So we all have mineral soils, but whether those are broken down so small that they are clays, which are microscopic, can't even be seen by the naked eye, silts that are about the size of a pinhead or a pinpoint, then you get your larger particles of sand and gravels. And so how those are put together will determine what your soil type is. So this is just an example of what sand itself looks like under a microscope. And it's a whole array of not only minerals, but in this case, other kinds of particles, remnants of sea organisms and shells, etc. So your soil type influences the soil structure and whether you're and the pore space, how large or small that is in between them. If you've got very blocky soils or massive soils, everything is very compacted and tight and makes it very difficult for soil roots to penetrate. Whereas if your soil is granular and more pulled apart, you're going to have a much better air and water movement through those soils. So good soil structure is crumbly and easy to manipulate. It's workable. It resists erosion. It resists drying. And it holds on to nutrients better because it's got the soil life in it. And we'll be talking more about that. Whereas poor soil structure is much less capable of retaining water. Like I said, there's no air, no roots for penetration, or little air and pockets for root penetration, water moving through it, and therefore your nutrients get locked up and are not available to the plants. So this very frequently is one of the reasons that many people end up overwatering or over fertilizing, thinking that if they just put more on, they can overcome what they're seeing in their plants. And it actually makes the problems worse over time. Overwatering actually causes those pores to fill in and makes things even more compact with time. So the soil structure, we'll talk about soil structure and soil texture. They're two different things. So the structure is how the particles are arranged. And again, it affects your drainage, your circulation, and the amount of space available for soil organisms. Whereas, again, the poor soil structure, there's little room for retaining water, little room for roots, leading to over-fertilization and over-watering. So if you don't know quite what you have, there's an easy way to do that on your own. You can just take a jar, and I'm not going to go through the step-by-steps on this because everything is here to tell you how to do it. And this presentation is going to be made available in PDF form on our website. So you can go through, but just know that it's really, all it takes is a jar, a little detergent, and a spade to dig up some soil. And so you just want to make sure your soil is a clean sample, free of organic matter. You put it in the jar with some water, shake it up, let it settle out, and it'll settle out in layers that will allow you to do some calculations in terms of percentages of clay, silt, and sand. So the sand all will settle out first very quickly. Your silt will then follow, and then the clays will take much more time to settle out. But when they do, you can generally see 3 distinct bands in your jar. The easy way to do all this is to put the app, the Web Soil Survey app on your phone, or you can even access on a laptop. And this is my property in Cool. And as you can see, it shows I've got pretty much 2 types of soil that is identified on my property. So you've got these bands with these designations. You come over here and you can see what these designations are. It shows you, it has the soils named. And then from there, you can click on those and it'll tell you, oops, I'm going to go back. When you click on these, it will tell you exactly what you have. So in my case, all of my soils are pretty much silty loams. And this was an old cherry orchard, or part of the property was an old cherry orchard at one time, and the old Needle ranches over here. So these were farming soils used for farming purposes. And I think that they really actually do reflect that when I tried to do my own jar test. So the tilth of the soil, that's one of the things that we as gardeners talk a lot about. It's like, oh yeah, we like tilthy soils, or they envy somebody who has tilthy soils, is usually the case. But tilth itself is a whole mixture of talking about the characteristics of texture, the structure, how everything is aggregated, and then the density, how well it drains, in combination of water holding capacity. Drainage itself may seem like good drainage and good water holding capacity seem like they're competing interests, but they're not, because there's what we really want in our soils is for water not to stand. We want it to drain through, but we also want the characteristics of the soil holding on to as much water as possible and not just letting it all drain out. So, excuse me. Well, of course, the dog wants to be rambunctious right now. Okay, so one of the things you can do with your soils is perform your own drainage test, which involves digging a deep hole, filling it with water, and then seeing how long it takes to that water to drain out. If it takes more than 8 hours for water to drain out when you're doing this test, you really do have an issue, and you need to consider the kinds of plants you put in, and even perhaps taking some measures to drain water away if this is the case. Soil color can tell you a lot about what your soils are composed of, but they can also tell you a lot about how much organic matter and fertility that there is in the soils. As you can see from this, oftentimes I know my soils look like, naturally, without me having done any soil improvements, kind of fall in this range. A lot of the soils in this area are the redder colors, which means that in general that there's more iron in the soils, but you can see that there's quite a wide range of the colors in the soils. With the addition of organic matter, what we're all trying to achieve is this nice chocolatey espresso brown color. And that's an indicator of lots of organic matter. So again, soil color is influenced by your original minerals that you've got on your property that comes from the bedrock. And organics result in those darker colors. And as you build up organic matter in your soil, you will see the soil transform from a lighter color and get darker and darker with time. Gray is not a good color to find in your soil, and if you find pockets of it, it's usually an indicator that there's anaerobic conditions. This is very common down in pockets of Folsom and down in the valley, where you've got layers of this very, very fine clay that builds up and creates a layer that's impenetrable. So anyway, these do exist. And if you come across them, you kind of need to just look around and really see how your land is running off, how water is running off. It's probably laying in a pocket, and that's why you get these pockets. And again, the orange to red indicates the presence of oxidized iron, which is not a bad thing at all. So soils testing is something that's gone on for a couple hundred years, and probably the last 100 years more frequently, because of the farming communities have really pushed this so that they, excuse me, my dog. So anyway, the soils testing tells them about the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that is existing in the soil. The problem is it doesn't measure plant available nutrients. And we'll talk a little more about that later on. So these the soils testing that most labs do are not an indicator necessarily of the fertility of your soil. What you really do want to know more about is your soil texture and the pH of your soil. If you are having issues with plants yellowing or just not knowing quite, if you've got something going on that's indicating that there's a problem, doing a soil test may reveal what that issue is. The reason that soil pH is so important is because it influences how roots take up. Well, it influences the availability of nutrients to the plant roots themselves. And back. So you can see you've got anywhere from the acid to neutral to alkaline. With nutrients, there's a range in which they are made very available to plants. Outside those ranges, either to the 2-acid side or the 2-alkaline side, those start to get bound up chemically and just cannot be exchanged across the root zones, the root barriers. So you really want to take, if, like I said, if you're having issues, you can get little pH test kits at your garden centers or on Amazon or whatever. So that's easy to measure. You don't have to send out and have a soils test done necessarily to find that out. So a little bit acid's okay, a little bit alkaline's okay. Generally, you want everything a little bit to the acidic. That's where most plants are happiest. So our typical approach to gardening over the last 100 years has been to rototill, fertilize, water like crazy, raking away your leaves, the use of herbicides and pesticides to kill whatever seems to be eating our plants has been the traditional approach. And most gardeners, in talking with other people in that, and this is something that Master Gardeners hopes to kind of keep at bay, are these blends of old wives' tales, anecdotal science, which gets this very common. I say it all the time on Facebook or other sites. And then you've got your sales pitches at your garden centers that a lot of these people are not really trained. They're just taught to sell, and they hear something, they've been told something, and so they keep passing this information off onto you, getting you to buy products. So relying on science is very important in terms of getting this information right. The science typically with regard to soils has been limited to just talking about the physical structure of soils. And then, like I said, the nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus aspect of measuring soils for fertility and relying on that. And then you'll get recommendations on how much to add to your soils. And it really is not what's beneficial to the soils. It does not help build your soils. So the new approach that has been really, when I say new approach, it's really been the last 10 years that we're seeing a major turnaround in how we see soils and understand how they're working. It's leading us to a whole different approach of managing the soils in a different way. It allows the soil organisms to work for you, and you'll come to understand a little bit better. And it'll allow you to be a better gardener and steward of your own landscape. So we're going to talk a little bit about the soil food web. Cultivating our soil is as old as man is himself. Ever since man started into agriculture, they've been cultivating it. But our modern life and how we are sold products or told what we should be doing has changed that. Whereas gardening with the soil food web reconnects us with those natural processes and can reap a lot of benefits with a lot less work for how we do this. So it all begins with plants. Bottom line, plants and soils together. Obviously, one needs the other, and it's a cycle of constant feedback cycle. But photosynthesis is what takes the sun's energy, turns it into carbon in the form of sugars, feeds that into the soil, leaves drop, everything decomposes, and on you go. You're building soil. Those sugars that plants are produced are referred to as exudates. Some people, like Elaine Ingham, refer them to cakes and cookies to feed soil life. So in the rhizosphere, which is that area closest to the roots of a plant itself, these exudates are being exchanged for nutrients with soil organisms. And these soil organisms are really key to helping feed what the plant needs as the plant needs it. So in a healthy soil, you really don't need to be fertilizing because plants are getting the majority of what they need simply through this exchange of exudates for nutrients. Otherwise, they are actually taking in some of it by air and getting whatever else they do need. So microorganisms comprise the majority of the soil food web itself. So microorganisms are organisms that are obviously require a microscope to see them. They're so small, there's no way to see them. So in the first level of these, you've got your bacteria and fungi that are pretty much eating each other and synthesizing and breaking down organic matter, and on up to a whole level of other organisms that are feeding on them. But they're also in the soil, working it up. They're decomposing and shredding and constantly, it's another food web itself. But that food web, all this interaction between these organisms break down that organic matter and release the nutrients that are in that so that they can be taken up by plants. So you can see in some of these images, it really kind of, this is a great example of just in a leaf litter pile, what kind of organisms are there. And they're not all microorganisms. These are more or less referred to as macroorganisms, but these organisms feed on the microorganisms in that organic matter. These organisms are what feed the other critters we enjoy seeing in our gardens, the birds, the amphibians, and all lizards, etc. So the activities of the organisms in the soil, like I said, really affect what we see above the soil. A teaspoon of healthy soils can contain 1 million to 1 billion bacteria, miles of fungal hyphae, and all of these other organisms. So even the microorthopods can be in the thousands in just a teaspoon of soil. And the greater the biodiversity of those organisms, the greater the health of your soil itself. The presence of these soil organisms actually helps eliminate and reduce the need for fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides. And talk a little more, I'll be talking more in detail about that. But they really improve your water and air holding capacity. So again, kind of looking at the intricacy of how this all works with all these organisms in the soil, they all act and influence the health of the soil, which influences the health of the plants. I'm not going to read this to you. There's a whole set of functions that these organisms provide. And so if you're really interested in it, the NRCS, the National Resource Conservation Service, has a fabulous website all about soil health and soil organisms. But I'll leave this, you can go back and read this yourself to understand more how these organisms interact. It's enough to have at least a basic understanding that what these soil organisms do is to help, number one, break down and decompose the organic matter on the soils as leaves fall and as roots die back, etc. and manures. I mean, if we didn't have organisms breaking this matter down, we'd be just, you know, just manures themselves would be overwhelming. Obviously, they break down very quickly. The organisms help sequester carbon and nitrogen and all the other nutrients that we know plants need. They fix nitrogen from the atmosphere and make it available to plants. They do help improve soil aggregation and porosity. As that organic matter gets incorporated into the soil particles are held more apart. So that does help. These soil organisms really help keep the pests like the damaging nematodes and fungi that are in the soil. They help keep all of that in balance. They may still be there, but at least they're not out of control. If they get out of control, you know it, and there's something really wrong with your soils. And they provide food for each other and above ground animals. So the primary benefits of the soil food web are, number one, your soil fertility. It does the work for you of making sure plants get what they need. Some great books. Oh, this is a great, The Soul of the Soil is a fabulous book on that's in layman's language. It's enjoyable reading, but through the activities of soil microbes, the basic raw materials needed by plants are made available at the right time, in the right form, and the right amount. They are nutrient facilitators, you know, and help make sure those plants are getting what they need. And they actually, with time, help form humus, which is a very stable form of carbon in the soil. And that actually helps, again, hold soil particles together and bind them so they don't just necessarily wash off or continue to compact. In a normal garden bed, if you're not walking on it all the time, the soils just tend to stay lofty. So with all these organisms in the soil, as they're ingesting each other or breaking down, etc., everything in life contributes to the poop loop. The decomposers and the predators and all the rest of it. And it's part of, besides the bodies of these organisms breaking down and decaying, as they excrete, that becomes part of the soil as well and greatly adds to the fertility of the soil. So these organisms really contribute greatly to carbon cycling. And that's one of the reasons that they talk a lot about carbon sequestering with soils, and how, because there's two main pools of carbon. One's the organic carbon that is in every living organism that gets broken down, is constantly traded. It's used in making the sugars in the saps. It's part of the skeletons, all of the body parts, etc., that all of us, every living organism has. And then you've got your inorganic carbon that is just there in the soil and does not change. I've talked a little bit about anaerobic. So again, it's very important that your soils are not compacted, because when soils go anaerobic, it's generally, you can tell because it gets very smelly, much like sulfur, but it also is the place where the not so good bacteria and fungi, that's their happy place. And so things like Clostridium and E. coli, again, healthy soils help keep all of that in a balance and reduce the likelihood that these organisms will become a problem in your garden. Healthy soils actually help control disease and keep everything, the competition alone keeps everything in check. So the nitrogen cycling, you're wondering, how can I get away from using my fertilizers? Especially for the normal garden, as opposed to the vegetable garden. We can talk about that a little more later or in the question and answers. But in your traditional garden, the garden that you're not harvesting for food, the organisms, the soil organisms, and certain types of plants that have nitrogen fixing nodules on them help absorb and convert that nitrogen to a plant available form, which is then able to be either traded off or just absorbed by the plants themselves. Bacteria are chemosynthesizers, and they are the primary decomposers in the soil. They're the thing that is the most prevalent in the millions and billions in terms of that teaspoon of soil. So you'll find that the populations of those are the very biggest. They're eaten by almost everything else that's in the soil, and including themselves. They feed on each other at times, certain species. And they're generally found right around the root zone of the plant. So they live in the presence of oxygen, good healthy soils that are, and they take a major role in the breaking down of toxins and pollutants. Hopefully in most of our gardens, we are not having to deal with that. But they're releasing carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, and some of that is taken up again, making sulfur and nitrogen available. One of the more miraculous things that bacteria do in the soil is to create a biofilm so that they can actually, they excrete this, and it allows them to move through the soil. And they actually can help moderate the pH to the desired level of the plant. And they use it for moving through the soil, but it also provides a protective barrier, and it provides a binding characteristic that helps gently hold soil particles together. Fungi come in a range of different forms, from yeast, molds, Mycorrhizae, which are the hyphae and mushrooms of fungi, and endophytes that actually live inside the plant. And these are all mostly beneficial. They are the primary decaying agents in the soil food web. They break down, they're what break down the lignin and cellulose of plants, leaves, stems, twigs, etc. As logs fall, it's the fungi that break that down and start to decay so that other animals can take it in, so that it gets absorbed or incorporated into the soil. The bones of animals, that's all, fungi are all responsible for this part of breaking that matter down. So they're decomposers. They help cycle the nutrients, because as they metabolize these elements, they then get traded, or other things consume them for those elements. They help build soil structure, because the fungi, and you'll see some photographs where just the network of hyphal fungi really physically help hold soil together and bind it and pull it apart in cases where it needs, it can help break those apart, and help prevent disease. So what we're used to seeing when we talk about fungi, or what we really see and pay attention to, are the fungal bodies, which are just the seed producing parts, or the bodies that allow it to reproduce. Underground, this is the major portion of the importance of fungi, is that they're hyphae, which grow end-to-end strands, very tiny organisms, actually expand the root systems of the majority, 95% of the plants in nature have a relationship with mycorrhizae that expands their root systems. And it creates, you can kind of see this one photo off to the right, how much the root system is expanded by the presence of mycorrhizae. So it grows in association with those roots, and it's symbiotic in that it benefits greatly both of the plant and the mycorrhizae, or the mycorrhizae itself. They can tremendously extend the distance to locate minerals and nutrients and water that plants need. And I believe this is probably one of the most major phenomenons behind the success of native plants as we know them, without the interference of people needing to water, fertilize, etc. This is, mycorrhizae are what make plants successful in nature. Like I said, 90 to 95% of plants have associations with, and there's hundreds of species of mycorrhizae. There may be more than that, but it's lots of variety in terms of the different species that they know of. And so they help convert insoluble nutrients to the plant available forms, and they're especially important in making phosphorus available to plants. They are the primary source for that. And they exchange these nutrients for those sugars that the plants put out. And the waste from that cycle also provides nitrogen. So mycorrhizae really has kind of two forms, the ectomycorrhizae and the arbuscular, and I'm not going to go into all of that. It's just important. It's nice to know that there's these two different forms. One lives within the plant and the other pretty much works on the outside to make all of this happen for plant health. So again, mycorrhizae unlock and make available phosphorus is the primary one, calcium, magnesium, zinc, iron, copper. Sound like a bag of fertilizer to you? Yep. So we also, in addition to mycorrhizae and things that we see, we oftentimes see slime molds, and they're not fungi. They're a different classification of an organisms, but they're often found in association with decaying organic matter. I have found this upper one. Well, I think these are all look like dog vomit slime molds, and that's what they're called. Because you really, when you first see them, it's like, oh, my dog must have gotten sick. But this is just this lower right. It starts out coming out of a mulch pile, looking like this. Pretty soon it becomes this nice bright sulfur yellow. Each one of these phases only lasts like a day. And then eventually it becomes this blob. And if you disturb it, it kind of sends out its spores. These are perfectly safe. Don't need to worry about them. Don't need to destroy them or spray them or anything else. They're perfectly healthy in the soil context of soil health and anything else. My dogs have never disturbed them. So other organisms in the soil that are very important in terms of the soil food web include protozoa and threadworms. They're very widespread, and they also help with this whole thing of breaking down organic matter further, and they eat bacteria and fungi and keep all of these elements moving in the soil. Their waste contains carbon and mineralized compounds. So 80% of the nitrogen from plants comes from protozoa poop. So again, you can just not even being aware of these organisms, and you don't have to try to work at any one of them. There's just all of these exist in the soil together in a healthy soil system, but they all contribute to the soil health. And then worms are really reliant on the presence of protozoa if you want a healthy population of earthworms in your soil. Nematodes, there's good nematodes and bad nematodes. So they're non-segmented roundworms. Most of them are invisible to the eye or just barely like a fine hair. They're, unless you're really paying attention, you're never going to see these in your soil itself. But it requires porous soil because these are soft-bodied organisms. They require porous soil to be present. And then we've got all the other macroarthropods that feed and rely on the microorthropods. Those chitinous exoskeletons that get shed are broken down in a form of all kinds of nutrients and minerals available for plants. They mix and help aerate the soil. Beetles in particular are very important in doing that. Again, their poop cycle adds organic matter. And then you've got the shredders and predators. Then the shredders help break down leaves and all the other larger particles that the microorganisms are too big for the microorganisms to deal with. So these organisms start the cycle along with fungi of breaking everything down so that it can be taken in by everything smaller. So again, you've got your microarthropods, which only can be seen with magnification, and your macros, and including from mites and springtails, that really, because those are barely visible, and without reading glasses even, yeah, definitely not visible. So just going to quickly, we've got soil mites, and they're fine. You know, a lot of people worry, what's this crawling around in my soil? Do I need to kill it? No, you don't. Please don't. Springtails, you can see just how very tiny these are. Chances are you're not going to see them. But again, they feed on bacteria and fungi and provide food for other animals. Termites and ants, this is one of those things. These are both shredders as well. They play a very important role in the ecosystem, your soil ecosystem. Their tunnels, through their actions, they spread the bacteria and they move organic matter and all of that. They're very, very important. Where they're not so good is when they find their way into your home or into the wood underneath your home. Yes, then you need to take appropriate measures to deal with them. But if it weren't for some of these organisms like termites, again, there would be just a tremendous buildup of dead wood that isn't getting broken down. So they do play a viable, important role. So when you see them out in the yard, I really encourage you, let them be. And our beloved earthworms, healthy soil contains roughly 10 to 50 per square foot. If you take a good shovel of dirt and break it apart gently and then just let them all go back, it's an easy way to kind of assess the health of your soil. They are master shredders. They tend to take the organic matter that sits right on top of the soil and pull it down and break it up. So they provide aeration services, which increase the porosity of your soil. And they help with soil aggregation because they also exude slimes on their body. If you've ever picked up a worm, you know they're slimy. And that gets left behind. Between the slimes, the organic matter, their poop that they leave behind, it all helps with soil aggregation and water holding capacity. And also it provides food for more bacteria and the other microorganisms. So it just builds on itself. When you've got earthworms, it really helps. They aid in new root growth because they're providing more airspace for those roots to be able to expand. And obviously the fertility as well. Nothing quite like earthworm castings to help boost your garden in terms of fertility. Their castings, vermicastings is what they're referred to officially, are 50% higher. Let's put it this way, soils that are rich in earthworms are higher in organic matter than soil without worms because of the actions of earthworms. And then you can see they're much richer in all these other nutrients that plants need as well. So you can see how important the role of earthworms is to a garden and to your soils. Humus is very important to soil health as well. And what that is things have gotten broken down to a point and transformed, but those molecules are too complex and too large for soil organisms to decompose any further. And so they become sort of a stable element in the soil. It improves the biology and the health and all the properties of the soil, but it's just kind of there, stays there, and it's not really available to bacteria and other soil organisms as a food source. So kind of to recap the benefits of the soil food web. A healthy soil food web helps control disease, especially soil-borne disease. But one of the things it helps do is when your plants are healthy and not under stress, it helps your plants fight off disease and pests as well. Plants have a lot of mechanisms for dealing with the constant bombardment of pests in terms of other insects, fungal diseases, bacterial diseases, etc. And the healthier they are, just like with us people, the healthier we are, the better we are, more capable we are of fighting off disease and attacks. It helps the benefits, it reduces the need, or actually eliminates the need for fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides because of that health. And it also improves your water and air holding capacity. So we talked a little bit about the fact that the bacteria and fungi produce a slime that actually helps bind your particles together in a healthy way. And so does the fungal hyphae. So it really improves the structure of your soil. So the bacteria and fungi are equivalent to your fertilizer itself. And the protozoa and nematodes, ants, etc., many of the other larger macroarthropods provide our fertilizer spreaders because they move all of those around. So trees and shrubs and perennials, and there's different preferences for either fungal dominated soils or bacteria dominated soils. And studies show that like areas that are meadows and that and don't have a lot of woody vegetation are bacterial dominated. The forests, like the oak woodlands and the pine forests that we live here in El Dorado County for the most part, are more fungal dominated soils because we have so many trees, shrubs, etc. And so just knowing that helps kind of get an idea of what your soil may already have going for it. I know that there's a big movement afoot, and garden centers try to sell Mycorrhizae in packets, and a lot of people feel they need to do that. They're really not beneficial. They're probably dead. So don't fall for that, but knowing what you've got, and we'll talk a little more about how you can change that. But anyway, and it's actually plants that control, for the most part, control the pH of the soil you have. Now, if you do have a soil Again, development, building homes, it's that you remove the topsoil and maybe you don't necessarily have really great soils. And because of those changes, the pH of your soil can be modified from what was there to begin with. However, for the most part, once you get plants reestablished in your gardening, the plants will start to modify the pH of the soil themselves. So dung, just as the rest of the poop cycle and with microorganisms, those given off by other animals in up above the ground is all getting recycled. The feet of these animals spread microbes. So, and obviously all of these organisms rely on the insects and that are in the soil as well. That's their primary source for nutrition. So people are so used to using fertilizers, and it's kind of you have to change your mindset in terms of thinking about why and how you use these. So and knowing how damaging they can be to that life in the soil can help you make that shift pretty quickly. One of the negative aspects is they reduce soil production of plant available nitrogen. Chemical fertilizers are salts, and they really interfere with the soil organisms themselves. The bacteria and fungi are reduced in numbers and diversity by the use of chemical fertilizers. So when your micro population declines, you get a decline in all of those things that are going on in terms of the dispersal of nutrients among your plants. And it goes right on down the line until you are also reducing your worm population as well. And worms are definitely irritated by chemical fertilizers. They deteriorate as those organisms decline. You're deteriorating your soil structure, decreasing your water holding capacity. And the last thing you want to be doing is increasing the salts in your soil, because that makes all those things less available to your plants as well. And chances are you will increase the presence of all the pathogens and pests that you don't want. So rototilling has its place, but used on a regular basis, as so many gardeners are used to doing, and especially in your vegetable gardens, it really can have a deleterious effect. It really is damaging because it breaks up that fungal hyphae. It absolutely destroys the worm populations. It'll pulverize all the arthropods in the soil that we've been talking about, how they are incorporating and eating everything else in the soil and then distributing. So rototilling itself just really is damaging to your soils. And in turn, what happens is as it just keeps destroying the structure of the soil, your soils become more and more compact. But rototilling once to get organic matter into the soil or get your soil workable is fine. I've done it a number of times. Let's put it this way. I've done it once a number of times in various areas around my yard for the purpose of moving dirt and getting lots of organic matter incorporated. And now my soils in those areas are just off the charts. So soil building, when you start to do it, you'll get that positive feedback, and it will be, really actually for the gardener quite exciting. As you start to build it, it just continues to improve because the more activity and the more life you get into that soil, it builds on itself to keep improving. But on the opposite side, so is soil decline. So, once it starts going downhill, if you keep using fertilizers, you keep rototilling, you keep destroying, and you're going to end up reaping the not so great benefits on the other end. So Proper care and feeding of soil organisms demands close attention to managing those soil organisms. Again, another good quote from Soul of the Soil. So the first priority in restoring your soil food web involves 3 primary strategies: building and maintaining humus, composting, and mulching. I think we've gone over these enough in terms of what the positive aspects are for building your soil. So the amendments for building and maintaining your soil include compost, mulch, possibly compost teas, the mycorrhizal fungi, and I'll talk to you about these other amendments, that they're not necessarily, so hang on here. So compost is key. It's the organic matter that in nature, as trees and shrubs and etc. lose their leaves, typically without interference, those leaves will just decay and be reincorporated into the soil from where they came, in terms of the nutrients haven't been taken up, photosynthesis, leaves on the trees, they drop, and just constantly recycling. Without us, nature has done just fine in terms of growing forests in a nice, healthy ecosystem, especially in our state. We're very lucky that way. So compost in its place for the average gardener replaces that. And compost is really high in microbial life and all the microorthopods already. If you get a good, balanced or well-made homemade compost, and you can use it to inoculate your soil, but use it to also get that initial boost. If you haven't already landscaped and are starting a new garden, really giving it a huge shot of organic matter will be one way to really just get that off the ground and establish a good, healthy system. For a new garden, starting with something on the order of 12 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet, that's a 4-inch layer or more. I used roughly a foot in mine, between compost, horse manures, my own compost, homemade, so I bought compost, made my own homemade compost, llama poop, you name it, just whatever you can get that way. Just don't be using pig poop or anything on that order, no dog or cat feces, and then annually, once you have your garden established, putting compost down over your garden areas to the greatest extent possible, roughly 1/4 to 1 inch around the plants, avoiding the crown, is a way to continuously feed the soil. Mentioning the animal manures, the horse manures, composted horse manures, you don't want to be putting any, with the exception of alpaca and rabbit pellets, everything else should be aged for at least 6 months. And it's even better, it's if you can add it to your compost. If you do composting at home, that's the best way to do it. I have found even with the most well composted horse manures that I got truckloads to put into my garden area, my yard, and I'm still pulling the weeds from that. But so, it brings with it some issues, but it's a great source for organic matter for your garden. Green manures are also very beneficial, and it's any crop that's chopped and dropped before it, you can let it flower, but before it seeds, traditionally is the way that's done. And the roots themselves help with soil life. And then once it's cut off, the matter decomposes and provides biomass to all the soil organisms for them to ingest and incorporate into the soil. And in particular, if you are using legumes for a green manure, it will help provide more nitrogen if you need that nitrogen boost. So letting clovers and that kind of thing grow, whether or not you let them go to seed, can be very beneficial. And if you have heavy or compacted soils with little organic matter, this can be a really great way to give your soils that initial boost besides the use of compost. There are spring planting and fall planting mixes available. There are mixes that require regular irrigation and some that are particularly formulated for low water uses. Pleasant Valley, just for instance, if you go to Pleasant Valley, I believe it's organic.com, is a great place just to look at what kind of variety is available out there. And then from there, you'll get some idea of what those are and can shop accordingly, according to your needs elsewhere if you want to. Ground cover crops in themselves, especially if you have trees, fruit trees, and that is a great way. And cover crops in areas that are going to be vegetable beds, or cover crops among your vegetable beds, is even better in terms of than just a traditional vegetable bed without anything else mixed in. Cover crops help boost the nutritional availability of elements in the soil to your vegetables. So you plant those right alongside. That does help suppress your weeds. And one of the really big benefits is it helps attract and feed beneficial insects, which then help keep the pests out of your garden. So using cover crops provides not only benefits your soil, but it acts as an organic pest control. And it helps shade the soil, so it helps your soils not evaporate so quickly in terms of the water. It'll help hold that in. So there's kind of a two-way thing here, is that yes, cover crops do absorb water, but the thing is that the metabolism and the way things work in the soil is with that sheltering from the sun, you get more of a benefit of the cover crop than not if you don't use one. Both water and fertilizing or nutrients. Organic mulches. It's very important for the most part to keep your garden soils covered so that the soil is not just exposed to sun, compaction, etc. Whether you use, and organic mulches are the best. And there's two exceptions to this. One is within 5 feet of your home. If you live in a fire-prone area like we do in the foothills here, you want to maintain any organic mulches at least 5 feet away from any structures. There you want to use a layer of gravel or something else, unless you're an avid weeder. And then you also want to maintain some areas of patches of bare dirt for native pollinators, because native pollinators need bare soil for their underground burrows. And 70% of our native pollinators are underground nesting bees. So just know that you don't want to cover every square inch of your garden, but for the most part, organic mulches are going to be more beneficial because being organic, they rot, they decay, they're incorporated into the soil, and so they keep improving it. So you do need to replace your mulches, organic mulches, occasionally. For each 1% of increase in soil organic matter, it increases the soil 20,000 gallons or more per acre. So you can see that not only does it feed the microbes in the soil, but all this organic matter acts as a sponge to hold on to the water tremendously. It makes a huge difference. I know that in the areas, because I'm on 5 acres, the areas that I have improved with organic matter versus my natural soils, out on other parts of my property, there's a huge difference in how quickly everything dries out. This is a good before and after picture somewhat. I mean, if you know your mulches, you can see the difference before. Bare dirt, that tends to compact a whole lot more. One of the things that mulches do is help take that pound per square inch and disperse it and make it so that the earth underneath of that mulch does not compact to the same degree as just bare earth does. So it also helps, so it reduces evaporation. It does help it can help prevent weed growth, but it makes them a lot easier to pull too. Insulates the roots of your plants, keeping them cooler, especially during our hot summers. But again, you'll have more beneficial organisms. But again, to make sure that you taper away from the plants and stems of your, the trunks and stems of your plants, because you don't want that to be a place where rot starts to occur. We don't talk a lot about compost tea with master gardeners simply because every batch is different when you're making compost itself. And so there's no way to actually do a scientific experiment on this stuff and studies the way, because you need to be able to replicate them. But it is another mechanism used by gardeners commonly to try to boost the microbial population, both with their plants and their soils. And so it is out there. I just wanted to talk. It can be very beneficial. You just need to make sure that you're using a really good source of compost, or that the compost you're making is well balanced, and then go from there. Landscape fabrics are something that we have discovered can be very detrimental to our soils. The best use of landscape fabrics perhaps is underneath areas where you have absolutely no landscaping. I've used them under my pathways, my gravel pathways, but other than that, they have no place in the garden because they totally interfere with all of the interaction going in on the soil. When you don't have organic matter able to be incorporated, water does not move through those the same way it does through a mulch. So anyway, and the ground underneath those eventually becomes more compacted because you don't have as much soil life. So one of the ways, if you're going to either be converting or starting anew, besides rotilling in organic matter, the other approach would be doing sheet mulching, which has received a lot of attention in the last 10 years. And it simply involves putting down layers of paper, newspapers, cardboard, topped by compost, and then and then mulch on top of that and eventually, when I did this in an area of my yard, that cardboard was gone in 2 years. I mean, totally gone, just totally decayed into the soils. Now you want to reduce, you don't want to use boxes that are glossy. You don't want to use newspaper either. You don't want to use the glossy inserts or stuff with a lot of, that's not natural cardboard. And you want to try to remove as much of that tape as possible because it will come back up when you're gardening. This is a great Toby Hemingway's compost, sheet-proof mulch recommendation is one way to, I think you can see with all the various layers in there, a great way. And now, once you do the sheet mulch, you can plant right through it. So it's something that once you put it down, it's not something you have to pull up or incorporate into the soil. You can just literally just plant right through this. So, you know, if you've got some plants that are pretty difficult, with the exception of Bermuda grass, if you want to replace a lawn or parts of a lawn or just have a big weedy area, this is a great way to approach that and improve your soil all at the same time. So other soil nutrients that they talk about in terms of improving your soil, for the most part, your soils have everything they need. It's just a matter of getting that organic matter into the soil, getting the populations of all the soil organisms going, and letting them do the work for you. Generally, most of these nutrients or these amendments are recommended for farmers because they're always removing the crops and taking them off site. So there's nothing to replace what has been removed. That's why there's that need. So just kind of know that. I mean, you don't need to be going out and buying bone meal and, dolomite, lime, etc. And if you're going to use any kind of fertilizers, and even in your vegetable garden, really consider the use of organic fertilizers. They don't have the salts in them. They're not high count that burn your plants or ruin the organic life in the soil that you do have. So you're not being counterproductive with the uses of organic fertilizers if they're needed. I do use organic fertilizers in my raised beds. So besides all the organic matter, the compost and all that, oftentimes you'll see recommendations for rock powders or biochars. There's really no evidence to support that rock powders provide any benefit. And the research on biochar has been that its best place is actually putting it into your compost bin, and it won't decompose, but what it does is it provides more nooks and crannies for all of the microorganisms to hang out in the soil. So it can provide a benefit, but it's not the kind of benefit that you will see nurseries or people trying to sell it touting. Yeah. So this is the time that if your compost hasn't already been cooking, or mine's just constantly ongoing, but now's the time to start applying compost to your plants, your garden areas, to boost, because now we're getting into that. Your microorganisms are never totally dormant, but they slow down just like your plants do in terms of their metabolisms, slow down in the winter, peak in the summer, and then fall off again. So now is the time to start boosting that. Refresh your mulch under your trees. And soybean meal is something that can help because it is an organic, again, it's an organic matter that you can add to the soil to boost the sugars in it, and that to boost the organisms. In the summertime, continue to add green mulch or grass clippings, something like that, in your vegetable garden, and again, replenish all your mulches as needed. Don't let your soil become exposed. Incorporate any green mulches into your veggie beds in the fall, because everything starts to break down, and it gives everything plenty of time to decay before you start ramping up to plant in the spring. And forget about gathering up and storing leaves. One of the things we know about, I need to take that out. Your leaves are a tremendous refuge for moth and butterfly larvae. And so you really want to kind of let them be, so that those organisms are available there in the spring, and especially for birds, because they like to feed their baby birds caterpillars. So leave the leaves, rake them in under your oak trees somewhere out of the way if they don't belong, elsewhere in your garden. And apply any microbial foods like the soybean meal, all of these things, the powdered malt, oatmeal, etc., is all designed to kind of give the carbohydrates a boost in the soil. And they probably are, they are a good boost if you need that. And of course, we've got good old winter time, still a good time to be reading up on your garden books and informing yourself of how all this works. So just consider, no one's ever fertilized an old growth forest. Think about how things work out there, and yet they thrive. Following some of those principles can hopefully decrease the amount of work you have to do with your own yard and help enhance the health of your own garden. So with that, always master gardeners are available online, or the phones right now. I don't believe you're able to until we get through the rest of COVID, but master gardeners are still there for a source of information. So with that, we can go to questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Kit. Lots of really good information there. For those of you who do have questions, you can go ahead and type those in the chat now. I'm going to turn it over to Ruth, and she will go ahead and help with the Q&A session. Thanks, Ruth.
Unmute. Oh, there we go. There we go. We have a few questions. Let me get back to chat. One question from Karen. Do off-the-shelves organic fertilizers affect the soil the same as chemical fertilizers?
No, they're much healthier because they're all organic elements for the most part. They break down, they will help boost the soil organisms that then help make the nutrients, the nutrients that are in those, but plus, again, that whole thing going on in the soil, the poop loop, etc., will make the nutrients available to your plants. So no, organic fertilizers are the way to go if you need to supplement.
Then I had another question from David, which I think you answered. How does weed cloth compare to mulch for covering the soil?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Could you repeat that?
How does weed cloth compare to mulch for covering the soil?
Oh, no, weed cloth is absolutely a big no-no. I mean, that really impedes a soil's ability to the whole interaction, the air, water, the decay, plant material working its way down. It's very damaging. Weed cloths are damaging to the soil per se. So unless you're just using them under a walkway or someplace in a minimal, someplace you need to put rock on, like I have used weed cloth along the edge of the posts of my deck that I'm got cobble on, but it's just a strip 2 feet wide, just for maintaining a clearance so that plant material isn't up against my posts. So there are minimal areas where weed cloth might be appropriate to use, but not across the landscape.
And we had another question from Lyman. What are the steps to improve a pasture? Chemical tests saying that the pasture is okay. It's been part of a residential yard.
That takes a larger scale approach, and especially if you have animals on it. I have to think of this year I raised pigs, and you should see my pasture now. Oh my God. So it is going to be a lot more of a challenge if you have animals in your pasture. If you don't, and you can put a nice layer of compost, because you can buy compost by the truck and trailer loads, and spread that out and get that worked in a pasture. That's particularly a good area to use cover crops and green manures. Plant those you can either chop and drop or just let them be if they're not being grazed at the time. But actually you should chop. If you're trying to build your soil, you want to chop and drop before they've gone to seed, and they will get incorporated into the soil. So that would be the best approach for a pasture. Now, if you don't have irrigation, you need to get one of the mixes specifically made for drier situations.
Okay, thanks. Another question from Anne. What's the best mulch for slopes? One that are less likely to wash down the slope.
Oh boy, that is a tough one because, and again, I think of our area and how fire prone we are. And gorilla hair is what they call gorilla hair. It's got a lot of fiber. It's a very fibrous mulch, is one of the better ones because it knits together and doesn't tend to get shoved down the bank by rain and all of that. So you want to use larger bulk type, either finer mulches because they knit together, or you want to use big fibery mulches. But again, if proximity to your structures and the area you live needs to inform that decision on what you use. So
another question from Carolyn. What do you recommend about using gypsum to fix the clay soil and make it more workable?
Gypsum is a very temporary fix because what it does is it kind of gets between the clay particles, but it only lasts so long. It's organic matter is the fix for sand, silt, and clay. It will improve any soil. With your clays, it breaks it up and makes it holds it apart. And as long as you have incorporated a lot of organic matter into it, whether you're planting a hole, trying to plant one plant, what you want to do is dig a hole roughly 3 feet wide, 3 times the width of that container, and mix as much compost into the depth of the plant as possible to break that clay up. Better yet, if you can rototill a whole area of incorporating organic matter into that clay, you will find that it will not rebind as long as you top mulch it after you're done. Okay, good.
And from Deanna, so for a soil that's 90% clay, would compost and mulch, what compost and mulch would you recommend if I haven't stockpiled for this year's veggie garden?
So if you are planting in clay, ask that question one more time, please.
My soil is 90% clay.
Mm-hmm.
What compost and mulch would you recommend if she hasn't stockpiled for this year's veggie garden?
Well, I always recommend what's called a balanced compost. It's one that has all the browns and greens in it. Don't go for something that's strictly, say, mushroom compost. Mushroom compost can be mixed in with other compost. The more diversity you have in your compost, the more diversity you're going to get in terms of soil organisms. So you just want to find a good source for compost to begin with, and then mix that in. Your mulch, depending on what kind of vegetables you're growing, I mean, gosh, you can use anything from wood chips to straw to, whatever, or better yet, grow a small cover crop like a low-growing clover in amongst your vegetables. It'll help with the predators, with pests and pollinators. So.
And we have a question from Itzel. We live at 7,000 feet. Will a greenhouse be recommended?
It could be. I'm thinking 7,000 feet. Gosh, that's even above Lake Tahoe level. Yeah, if you're trying to start plants, a greenhouse can be very helpful. Even in our area, though, you need to be very careful about the siting of it and covering it in the summertime so that it doesn't become a hothouse, so to speak, an easy bake oven, because that's what I see so many people buying, those little greenhouses that are just all plexiglass, and stick them out in their, you know, in a sunny spot, and then they find they can't almost grow anything except for the little short period between November and March. So anyway, just be careful about where you put it and provide shading for it in the summertime.
Now I have a question from Audrey. I have deep deposits of oak and other leaf matter all over my yard. Is it okay to move the top layer, the newest leaves, to other areas on the property to get them working?
Sure. Just be gentle. Don't grind them up. Just move them in loose piles and gently spread them out so that you don't kill off the larvae or other insects that might be using them for nesting. But yes, you can move them around. It's helpful.
Then we have a question from Cecilia. It's about chicken poop. Can I add it to the general area of the yard, or do I need to compost chicken poop for 6 months?
Oh yes, absolutely. Chicken manure needs to be composted. I throw mine, I get it by the bucketfuls, or, you know, a gallon bucket. I scoop it up out of my coop and put it right into my compost bin. And so by the time it does get used, it's well incorporated into the compost itself. Yeah, don't ever apply chicken manure directly to your yard. It will burn whatever is in the area. Too hot.
Then I have a question from Stephen. I'm draining gray water from my kitchen to a large area of mulch in between some oaks and wild plums. It seems like it's benefiting the trees surrounding, but wondering if there are certain chemicals and dish soaps to avoid or anything to look out for.
Yeah, for the most part, I would make sure you're using dish soaps that are okay for that. A lot of them are high in certain kinds of chemicals, and I'm not exactly, I know that for myself, because we have a septic system, we're careful about the types of detergents and that we use. And so you definitely, especially for gray water systems, you do want to be cognizant of that and using soaps that are eco-friendly, because they can't, and if you're, boy, during the summer, I'd be very cautious about letting water run near oaks during the summertime, because what ends up happening is that wetness during the heat can trigger the growth of damaging fungi that can kill the tree, kill oaks. That's one of the reasons we don't water oaks around here in the summertime, is because it does trigger that fungi in the soil and can be very damaging.
And what about coffee grounds? Can I add that to my berry patch?
Directly? Yeah, I compost all of my coffee grounds. I think my compost is half coffee grounds. I wouldn't, you know, if you have the ability to compost it, I would recommend you compost it. Otherwise, I would go very lightly on the coffee grounds in terms of, you know, if you're using them around your berries. If you're using them around blueberries, my understanding, I don't grow blueberries, but that they like that more acid. So it might be, but I'm not an expert in that area. I would actually ask somebody with master gardeners about that particularly. But I would say, as long as you keep it to a relatively thin layer, just don't heap it up around your berries.
Another question from Stephen. I've been also adding compost from green waste recycling. He lives in Plymouth. Is this okay, even though it's not certified organic?
For the most part, if it's not, you know, so it's most likely okay. Hopefully, I'm trying to think of anything in those. Even if it had an herbicide in it, most herbicides are just direct contact herbicides. So that in itself, eventually, believe it or not, the soil organisms will ameliorate all the effects of most toxins. So I wouldn't hesitate. One of the things you need to be careful of, like with horse manure, is a lot of people deworm their horses. And there's a lot of concern about that dewormer affecting worms in the soil. But if it's well composted, most of the effects of that are going to have been already deteriorated with time. So anyway, same thing with non-organic compost, is that as long as it's well composted, you probably shouldn't be a factor.
Okay, thank you. We have to close the class now. Our time is up. Please, there's a lot of more questions, but that we didn't address. But if you could email your questions to ucanr.edu/sites. Where am I? Master Gardeners /files/1870019.
So
Thank you.
If I can, I'm going to quickly answer one question. Pulverized eggshells. I grind mine finely and put them in my compost bin. I don't like seeing crushed eggshells out in my yard around my plants. So anyway, yes, they're fine. It probably does help with the calcium input. If it's going to get taken up, it will, but it needs to be in a small, very small. So, okay.
Okay, thank you everyone for attending our class today. We will see you next time.